All right, Jerome, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our annual TALMUD Torah sponsor for the month of Tafshin Pei 5785. The Tilson Family is zechus from Eretz zechus for besuros tovos for all of Am Yisroel. Our TALMUD Torah sponsors for this last day of Tishrei, Dr. Linda Weinberg, in loving memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Paris, Moshe ben Avraham, David, and Avraham and Shaindy, Kelman, in memory of their parents, Jerome and Bernice, Kelman, and Alexander and Friderica, David. And our week of learning sponsors, Rabiel Natalie Amirian, in memory of Dr. Nilli, Ester, Malek, on the occasion of her yahrzeit. And our Daf Yomi sponsors, Milton Melanie Gertner, in honor of their new granddaughter, Mazel Tov, Evelyn Cara, Chava, born to Bobby and Shelley Dolitsky. Mazel Tov, his parents should be zechus Eretz Hashem, to see her grow into an incredible Bas Yisrael, should be zechus Eretz Hashem, to be nichnas into TORAH l'chupal l'maisim tovim, and Eretz Hashem be a source of nachas for her parents, for her family, for her community, for Klal Yisrael, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ad 120 shanim tovos. We'll say with that, and a good chodesh, let us begin. We are in Eretz Hashem hoping for a month filled with besuros tovos Klal Yisrael, a month of the return of our hostages, a month of success for our holy soldiers, b'chol ma'aseh yadeim, and a month of shalom and besuros tovos for all of Am Yisroel. Well, with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Kuf Chav Tes 129. We are picking up in Eretz Hashem on Kuf Chav Ches on base 128b, and we left off Vafilu l'Rabbi Akiva. A little bit kind of like mid-sentence here, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, we're talking about the following situation, a fascinating case, or actually a really riveting case. Reuven lent $100,000 to Shimon. So what happened? So now Reuven comes to collect. Reuven says, Shimon, you didn't pay me anything. Shimon said, I paid you half. Aiden come along and say that Shimon paid everything. So what's the halacha in this type of situation? So the Gemara quoted, so remember again, all of these conversations have been Rabbi Abba. So now the Gemara quotes Rabbi Abba, and the Gemara says, Harei nishba v'gova mechza min nechasim min nechorim. So the halacha is, Reuven swears, Shimon, right? Shimon the borrower. Shimon swears that he pays half, and ultimately again, Reuven is able to collect from the chasim b'nei chorim. Ultimately, again, from unencumbered property. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. Now, again, the logic behind that is, and that Reuven is unable to collect from the Chasim Mishubadim. Why? Because any people who purchase property since the time of the loan could simply say, we have Eidim, right? There's Eidos supporting that this loan has already been paid. So therefore, again, we rely on the Eidim, and therefore you can't extract sold property from us. So the Gemara says now, and even according to Rabbi Akiva, the Amr Meishiv Aveidahavi, even according to Rabbi Akiva, it says Meishiv Aveidahavi. So remember again, we started this case, if you look back in the Rashbam, so the Rashbam is 2, 4, 6, 8, about 10 lines up in the bottom. Puktet Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon, ben Elazar, betchilas shneim ochsin. Okay, so here's the machlokes. This is actually a fascinating case. Shtar shekasu bo sloim o dinarim. So watch this case. Reuven lent Shimon money. Now, interestingly enough, what does it say in the document? It says that Reuven lent Shimon sloim. That's all it says. Just says sloim. It doesn't say anything else. And then what happens? Samal va'omer chomesh. So the lender says, Reuven says, I lent you 5 sloim. V'lo va'omer shalosh. And the borrower says that I only borrowed 3. And they both say, now remember again, what's the problem with this case? What's the problem with the case? There is no amount that is mentioned in the document. So here's what's interesting. Here's what we know. What's the minimum definition of slime? Minimum definition? 2. Okay. So now, interestingly enough, lender's saying I lent you 5. Borrower is saying I borrowed 3. So what's the halacha? So Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Hoel v'hodem mikzas hatayna yishava. So again, Reb Shimon says this is a case of modem mikzas. What's the halacha by modem mikzas? Anytime that you have a partial admission, so what's the halacha? You pay for what you admitted, and you swear on the rest. That's Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Akiva comes along and says, what are you talking about? This is not motive of mikzas. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Eino ela kimeshiv aveda upater mishvua. So this is fascinating. Rabbi Akiva says, This is what's called Meshiv Aveda. Now, what does Meshiv Aveda mean? Returning of a lost object, which essentially is the way that Chazal said, you're going above and beyond already what the expectations are. Rabbi Kiva says like this, borrower, right, Shimon, the most Shimon can be liable for at face value is 2 slime. Why? Why? Because the document just says slime. Now, Shimon's coming along and saying, admitting that he owes 3. So Rabbi Akiva says he's like a Meshayda, he's like a guy returning a lost object. In other words, the lender has really no recourse for anything above 2. The borrower, of his own volition, is admitting 3. So Rabbi Akiva says, this is not a modeh b'miktzos, this is a Meshiv Aveda. He's coming along and he's admitting something that, technically speaking, he would not be legally liable to. Therefore, Rabbi Akiva essentially says, take him at his word, let him pay 3, and we're done. Now, here's what's interesting. Now, plug that into this case over here. So remember again, let's go back to our case. Reuben lent Shimon $100,000. Reuben says he paid me nothing. Shimon says, I paid you $50,000. And the witnesses come along and say that Shimon paid everything. So now both say, so now remember again, what did we say? Now, we treated this case as kind of like a little bit of like a Modeh Mitzvah's case. The Gemara suggests, even according to Rabbi Akiva, who in the Sloim case said that we take Shimon at his word because he's Meshiv Aveda, would agree that this case is different. I said, brother, the expression of Meshiv Aveda means that you're doing something that is nice, and halacha doesn't put you on the hook for any more. I'll give you an example. Let's say I come to Reuven, I find Reuven's wallet, I give it back. Reuven is has profound gratitude. He opens it up. He says, "Whoa, 1 second. There was $1,000 in here. Now there's $1. You owe me money." So what does the halacha say? The halacha says, no, that's not the way it works. In other words, when you return a lost object, that's it. You're done. In other words, I'm going out of my way to do something nice. Right? Otherwise, if you start making people take a shul, what's going to happen? No one's going to want to do it. So that's the expression of Meshiv Aveda, right? You're doing something additional that's nice. The halacha is not going to require you to do anything more. So the Gemara says, even according to Rabbi Kiva, Damar Meshiv Aveda, Hani Nilli, Heicha Deleka Edim. That's where there are no witnesses involved. Aval Heicha Deika Edim, Irsuse Irsas. So I'll say this is fascinating. See, the Gemara feels maybe the case is like this, right? So let's go back. Reuben lent Shimon $100,000. So Reuben brings Shimon to Beis Din. Shimon, you didn't pay me anything. Now I will say, now remember again, Shimon knows there are witnesses. Now, Shimon doesn't know what the witnesses are going to say, right? Now what's the raya that he doesn't know what the witnesses are going to say? Because if he knew that the witness is going to say it's totally paid back, he wouldn't say anything. See, he's worried. So the Gemara says maybe because he knows that there's witnesses, maybe he knows deep down that he owes everything, but he's nervous about what the witnesses are going to say. So he's modeh b'miktzos. So therefore, again, Rabbi Akiva's case of Meshiv Aveda only works when there are no witnesses. When there are witnesses, perhaps he's fearful, and that's why halacha l'maisa, he goes there, he admits to something. Okay. Maskef al Ravashi. Adrabo. I can see just the opposite. Even Rabbi Shimon Elazar says that this is modeh mixas. In other words, that the case of sloim, where the document just says sloim, he says that's modeh mixas. Hani mili heicha deleka edim. The commemoration. That's because there are no witnesses to support his claim. Aval heicha deika edim the commemoration vaday meshiv aveda havi. But certainly in this case, where again Shimon has witnesses, and what are the witnesses saying? That the debt is fully paid. That Allah Lamaisa Shimon should certainly be believed. Okay, so what's this? Therefore, it ends off with this machlokes case. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. Darsha Marzucha Mishmei Rav Simi Barashi. Hilchasa bechol hanishmaisisa kidishalach le Rabbi Abla Rabiel Natalie. So we'll say now the Gemara makes a statement that the halacha is in all of these cases. And I remember again, the common denominator amongst all of these cases is we're recording Rabbi Abba in all of them. So therefore, again, comes along Mar Zutra in the name of Rav Sim Bar Ashi and says the halacha follows Rabbi Abba in all of these cases. So the Gemara says, so just again a quick rundown, right? A quick rundown of all of these cases, right? So Rabbi Abba, let's go through. It was the first. So I underline this. Right? Rabbi Abba says, number one, you could collect from avadim are considered to be like real property when it comes to collection. Number two, Rabbi Abba held, what was number two? Good, government avadim. Next, Rabbi Rabbi Abba held that a first cousin once removed is kasher for edus. Number 3, right? Rabbi Abba holds that in order to go ahead and give edus, halacha l'maisa, as long as you are fit for the edus at the time of the event, even if you're unfit, right? And you're unfit now, you can't give the edus. Rabbi Abba also held that halacha l'maisa, again, like Rabbi Huda, that a father has the ability to identify his bachar. And Rabbi Abba held that a man has the ability to go ahead and designate property for his wife and allow her, gift her property to allow her to inherit along with the sons. And in this last case over here, Rabbi Abba held that halacha l'maisa, where Reuben says he didn't pay back anything, Shimon says I paid back half, and Edom says he paid back everything. That again is essentially treated like hamotzi like modeh b'mikzas shvua, but only collect from the chassav minichorer. Okay, those are all the cases. So now the Gemara says that halacha follows Rabbi Abba in all of these cases. What about the statement of Rav Nachman? I'm sorry, let me just read that again. The halacha follows Rabbi Abba in all of these cases. What about Rav Nachman's statement that Rav Nachman made earlier in the Gemara? So the way we read it ultimately again is we don't collect, is the way we read it, and so Rav Nachman agreed as well. So what are we coming to exclude? When we say the halacha follows Rabbi Abba, what are we coming to exclude? Top of Kuf Chav Tes. If you want to say it is coming to exclude the position of Rava, so the Gemara says, most sifu, Rav was just coming to add on to what was said before. If it's like if we're coming to exclude Mar Baravashi, we already established that the halacha does not follow him. If it's to exclude the positions of Rav Shmuel, Rav Sheshes, and Rav Papa, those have already been refuted. Ella lafuki mid Rabbi Yochanan. Rather, must he come into exclude the position of Rabbi Yochanan? Umid askafsa the Mar Bar Ravashi, and ultimately again also to refute the objection of Mar Baravashi. Okay, so we'll say so. Bottom line, halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara suggests that the halacha follows Rabbi Abba in all of these aforementioned cases. Beautiful. Let's go weiter. So we'll say, so remember again, back to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, remember again, if you make it tonight in your will, and in your will it says, I want all of my children to inherit equally, or I want this child to get this or this child to get that, what's the halacha? The halacha is it doesn't work. Right? Why? Because that is what's called a masna amasha kasav batorah. That is making a tanai which runs contrary to Torah law. And anytime you make a tanai condition that runs contrary to Torah law, your tanai is batal. What can you do? You can gift property however you want. Now the chiddush of the Mishnah was, if you have a document, even if the document mentions inheritance, as long as the word gift appears in the beginning, the middle, or the end, you're good to go. Now, the truth is, just so you should know, just for your estate planning purposes, it is more complicated than that, right? The way we pass halacha l'maisa is, it's not enough just to have the word gift in there somewhere, and as long as, in other words, you need to employ, in other words, if a person wants his children to inherit equally, or again, where this comes up more often is a person has daughters, and he wants his daughters to inherit along with his sons. So halacha l'maisa, again, there are halachic mechanisms. So again, the Mishnah makes it sound like, as long as, now, just to be clear, if during your lifetime you're gifting your property to your kids, that's fine, right? Because remember, again, a gift is not inheritance, and you could do whatever you want with a gift. But if after death you want your estate distributed a certain way, and you want your daughters or children to inherit equally, it is not as simple as just writing gift in your will. You have to employ certain halachic mechanisms. It's very important. So again, halachic estate planning is incredibly important if you want your estate divided up in certain ways. But in any event, the Mishnah says that as long as you have gift written in there, beginning, middle, or end, you're good to go. So it says the Gemara, Hechi dami matana b'tchila, Hechi dami matana b'emtza, Hechi dami matana b'sof. Let's give me an example of what it means where it's written matana in the beginning, the middle, or the end. So ki asur avdimi am Rabbi Yochanan tinasin sadeh plonis leploni virsha. So, for example, let's say again, Reuven wrote in his will, let my field be given. Let so-and-so field be given to Shimon, right? And he will inherit it. Zohi matana betchila. So we'll say, you notice how that's written? It's written tinasin. Let it be given. Let it be given as lashon of a gift. So that it mentions gift in the beginning, even though it mentions Yerusha in the end. So that's an example of where you have gift written in the beginning. Yersha vitinasin lo. So let's say again, Reuven writes in a document, let this field be inherited by Shimon and it shall be given to him. So that's an example. Zohi matana basof. So that's an example, ultimately again, of an expression of a gift being written at the end. Yersha vitinasin lo v'yersha. So let's say Reuven writes again, I'd like this field to be inherited by Shimon. It should be given to him, and he will inherit it. Zohi matana be'emsa. So those are examples, ultimately, again, of matana written in the middle. Okay, so the Gemara is quite literally, right, writing out for us matana in the beginning, matana in the middle, matana at the end. The dafka ba'adam echa b'sada acha. So we'll say this is fascinating. Now, where does this work? Where does this work? So we'll say, so what's interesting about this, see, normally, before this Gemara, I would have thought like this. This seems to be that a person is writing contradictory statements. So in general, what do you do with contradictory statements? So there's machlokes. What's the machlokes? The machlokes is tafas lashon rishon or tafas lashon achron. In general, whenever you have contradictory statements, do you seize the first expression or do you seize the second expression? That is an ongoing machlokes that we've seen throughout Shas. Yet, interestingly enough, in this particular context, essentially what we say is we seize the expression of matana. Matana, that we see as the dominant one. Now the Gemara qualifies this. When is this so? Dafka ba'adam echad v'sada achas. This is as long as we're talking about one person with one field. One person and one field. Aval ba'adam echad ushtei sados. But if let's say you're talking about one person with two fields, or sada achas ushnei b'nei adam lo. So we'll say, so let me explain this. When do we say that if you have a document, right, and in the document it says a lashon, an expression of Yerusha and Matana, Yerusha and Matana, then which expression do we follow? We follow the expression of Matana, of gift. When is that so? So the Gemara is explaining right now that is so. That's in the case. This is the name of Rav Dimi, name of Rabbi Yochanan. That is so when you're dealing with one field to one person. But let's say again, I'm giving two fields to two people, right? And let's say for example, or let's do differently. One person, two fields. I'm giving two fields to Reuven. In what field A, I use an expression of matana. In field B, I use an expression of Yerusha. So the Gemara suggests we don't say that both are a matana. Instead, what do we say? One is a Yerusha and one is a matana. Same idea as if you gave one field to two people. Now, how do you give one field to two people? You split it. In other words, I'm giving one field to Reuven and to Shimon, right? The northern side is for Reuven, the southern side is for Shimon. One side I use an expression of matana, one side I use an expression of Yerusha. What's the halacha? The halacha is, whichever one I use lashon of matana for, that's a matana, and the other one is Yerusha. In other words, what the Gemara is expressing is as follows. The chiddush over here is that if you use both expressions in one transaction, then we assume, how do we label the transaction? How do we label it? As a matana. But that's only if it's one field to one person. The moment that the transaction is multifaceted, either it's two fields to one person, right? Or one field to two people. So therefore there's more than one transaction. Then the way we understand the double lashon is one transaction is Yerusha and one transaction is matana. So the Gemara says Rabiel Natalie disagrees, and it will say, by the way, of course, it goes without saying that obviously what two fields to two people is certainly going to be two transactions, right? So in other words, essentially the only time we're going to allow contradictory expression of Yerusha and matana to be interpreted as matana is dafka in a case of one field to one person. But if it's two fields to one person, one field to two people, or certainly two fields to two people, and the grantor uses lashon of Yerusha and Matana, we use that to mean one transaction is Yerusha, one transaction is Matana. Good. Rabbi Elazar says, no, not necessarily. Afilu Adam Echad Ushtei Sados. Listen to this. Rabbi Elazar says, even if it's one person and two fields. So in other words, that case is, I'm giving to Ruvain, right, two fields. One field I use an expression of Yerusha, one field I use an expression of Matana. Or Sada Achas Ushnei Bnei Adam. Or for that matter, again, one field to two people. So again, I'm splitting a field between Reuven and Shimon. For one of them, I use a lashon of Matana. For one of them, I use a lashon of Yerusha. Rabbi Elazar says, even in that case, they're both viewed as Matana. So according to Rabbi Elazar, as long as there is some level of singularity in transaction, transactional singularity. By the way, that is an excellent expression, right? As long as there is some level of transactional singularity, what does that mean? Either you're giving two things to one person, or one thing to two people. So as long as there is some level of transactional singularity, then as long as the expression of the lashon of matana was used, that's the overarching reality for all the transactions involved, right? So again, singularity, right? Transactional singularity, as long as there's some meeting point in the transaction, either again, two fields to one person or one field to two people, as long as you are using the lashon of matana, the whole thing is matana. But even Rabbi Elazar will agree, aval b'shtei sados ushnei b'nei adam lo. See, even Rabbi Elazar will agree that's what? That if it's two fields to two people, because what's the chap in two fields to two people? What's the chap there? No transactional singularity, right? It's two different transactions. Then even he will agree that if whatever you use lashon matana for is matana, whatever you use lashon Yerusha for is going to be Yerusha. So we'll say that's our machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. Kiyasir Rabin Amar Tina. So when Rabin came along, he said, Tinasin sada plonis lefloni v'yirash plona v'yirash ploni v'yirash ploni sada plonis. So we'll say, so what happens in the following case, right? I say, give so-and-so field, right? Give so-and-so field to Ploni, v'yirash, Ploni, sada plonis. So give so-and-so field to Ploni, and Ploni will inherit this particular field. So we'll say, so again, here I mamish have a lashon of matana and a lashon of Yerusha. So the Gemara says, so Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kana, Rabbi Yochanan says he acquires it, Rabbi Elazar Amar Lo Kana, and Rabbi Elazar says he doesn't acquire it. So the Gemara says, Amar Li Abaye, the Rabbin, so Abaye said to Rabbin, Anachsas lan chada, va'askafas lan chada. So on one hand, you've confirmed something that we already know, and on the other hand, you've created a contradiction. So here we go. Bishlam ad Rabbi Elazar lo kasha. So Rabbi Elazar is not contradicting himself. Why not? Kan ba'adam echad ushtei sados. So the first case is talking about, again, one person in two fields. And remember again, Rabbi Elazar holds that with one person in two fields, as long as in one of those expressions you're using matana, both are a matana. Why? Transactional singularity. Kan b'shnei adam ushtei sados. Whereas the second case is talking about two people in two fields. And what happens to two people in two fields? According to Rabbi Elazar, two people in two fields are two separate transactions. And therefore, again, whichever one you use lashon matana for is a matana. Whichever one you used lashon of Yerusha is Yerusha. Ela Rabbi Yochanan kasha. But Rabbi Yochanan, what do you do with the contradiction? It's not a problem. Amorai ninhu vali with Rabbi Yochanan. There is a machlokes amoraim as to what Rabbi Yochanan said. Okay, fine. So we'll say, so this is a machlokes well as Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish says, Lo kana ad sheyomar ploni uploni yirshu sadeh plonis uplonis shenasatim lohem b'matana v'yirshum. All right, so we'll say, so Reish Lakish comes along, and Reish Lakish has even a more expansive lashon. Reish Lakish says that halacha l'maisa, they don't acquire until you say the following lashon: ploni uploni yirshu sadeh plonis uplonis. So and so and so and so will acquire so and so and so and so field. Shenasatem lohem b'matana v'yirshum. That I've given them a matana and they've inherited. Reish Lakish says only if you say it like that is it a lashon matana. Okay. So the Gemara says b'plukta. We'll say, by the way, this is one of those Gemaras that highlights the power, profundity, and the need to be precise in what one says. I mentioned this many times. Rav Pam, so Shiva of Torah Das, said the worst word in the English language is whatchamacallit. Right? He says why? Because if you're saying whatchamacallit, it means that you have not given enough forethought to what it is that you want to say. In other words, that he says a Yid should never speak until you know precisely what you want to say and how you want to say it. Because what happens when you speak in ambiguity, or what happens when you speak without precision, or what happens when you speak without forethought? What do? You create confusion for yourself and for everyone around you. So you will say, isn't it incredible that what's still happening in these Gemaras, right? Ruvain says this stuff, and what do we think to ourselves, right? Right? Can you imagine somebody says, Ploni uploni yershu, sada plonis, uplonis, shenasatam matana v'yershum. Right? Can you imagine hearing that statement? What do you think to yourself? What the heck are you talking about? Right? Like what are you saying? Is it a matana? Is it Yerushalayim as well? Like, all of this happens because someone is not well thought out enough in what it is they want to say. And when I don't think before I speak, and I don't have enough precision in what it is that I want to convey, it creates ambiguity for myself and it creates ambiguity for others as well. And that's what I will say in general. Also, even in relationships, it is so important to say what you mean and mean what you say. Right? At the end of the day, we say things and they're open-ended statements, and we expect people to understand what it is that we're saying. If I speak in ambiguity, all ambiguous speech does is create a heightened level of relationship ambiguity. In life, it is so important with people who we love, with people we interact, to be able to say what we mean and to be as precise as we can with what we say and to think before we say it. So therefore, again, we can have that verbal specificity when conveying the ideas that we want to convey. Such an incredible Musa. Anyway, and the Gemara says, back to this. The Gemara says, Beplukta. So this whole thing is a machlokes. This whole thing is a machlokes. Amar Famnuna, Lo Shanu Ella Adam Echad V'Sad Achas. So now what we're going to see is, in fact, this machlokes, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Yochanan, and Reish Lakish, this is really a much bigger machlokes. Here we go. So the Gemara says, Beplukta Amar Famnuna, Lo Shanu Ella Adam Echad V'Sad Achas. We only assume that this machlokes is when does this machlokes? When does this work? In other words, when can you have both lashon of matana and yerusha, and the transaction is still deemed as a matana? That's only one person and one field. Aval adam echad ushtei sadas. But if you have one person with two fields, or sada achas ushnei bnei adam, or two fields with one person. One field with two people, it doesn't work. So we'll say that's reminiscent, right? That's reminiscent of the position of Rabbi Yochanan above, right? The halacha l'maisa, the only time, right, the only time that this works, ultimately, again, to use lashon of Yerusha and matana, and for the transaction still to be termed or still to be deemed a matana, is only when it's one person and one field. But as soon as you have one person and two fields, right, one person and two fields, or one field and two people, then we attribute the double lashon to one transaction is Yerusha, one transaction is Matan. Rav Nachman says, no, afilu adam echad ushtei sados. Even if you have one person and two fields, sada achas ushnei bnei adam, or two fields and one person. One field, two people. Both of those work. Why? Still in those cases, everything is a matana. Why? Again, we go back. Transactional singularity. According to Rav Nachman, as long as there is some level of transactional singularity, you can go ahead and look at the entire transaction as a matana. However, aval shtei sados ushnei bnei adam lo. But in the case of where you have two fields and two people, then Abba said there's no transactional singularity, and then the way we'll look at it is one transaction is a matana and one transaction is Yerusha. Rav Sheshes comes along and says, no, afilu shtei sados ushnei bnei adam. So Abba say this is incredible. Rav Sheshes says, not true. Even two fields and two people, and even Rav say, here the chiddush in this, I give one field to Reuven and one field to Shimon. For one of them I use a lashon of Yerusha. For the other one I use a lashon of Matana. Rav Sheshes will still say they're both called Matana. They're both called Matana, even two fields to two people. Amar Rav Sheshes, I will say, so now the shaila is, out of all the different positions, that one is the hardest to swallow. Right? Because that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. If literally, again, I'm giving one field to Reuven, one field to Shimon. For Reuven, I use lashon of matana. For Shimon, I use lashon of Yerusha. And yet, Rav Sheshes says they're both deemed matana. What's the logic of that? So here we go. I'm Rav Sheshes. How do I know this? This sign because we're in the brisa. What does the brisa say? Ha'omer tenu shekel. This is fascinating. Ha'omer tenu shekel ibni b'shabis. So listen, now watch this. I'm going overseas. I'm going overseas, or the Rashban says one or two cases. Either I'm going overseas, or a person is a shchiv meira. Right? So the father is going overseas, or the father is a shchiv meira. And what happens? He wants to allocate an allotment for his child. So he says, like to the executor, to the guy running his affairs, give a shekel to my son per week for his support. Now here's the problem. Or uyin litain sela, but the kid really needs a sela, not a shekel, for his weekly support. Then what's the halacha? No simlim sela. So you give a sela, because the way it is we look at the father's expression as, what does the father really say? What is he saying? Take care of my kid. Take care of my kid. Okay, so he used shekel much more as an expression than an actual amount of an allocation. Right? No, so therefore, again, we look at what the kid needs for his support, and we go ahead and we give it. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Nos, 4 lines up from the bottom. Nos in Lansela, to lo amar shakel elakadei lezonan bitsimtsum shalo yitnu yosem ichtei letzarchan. So I said, why did the father say shekel? Right? The father knows how much it costs to support his son. Why does he say shekel? What he means is, give my son what he needs in order to live, but not excess. Not excess. That's what he meant when he said shekel. Give him what he needs, but not excess. Okay, now watch this. Bim Amar, listen to this, but if the father said, Al titnu lahem ela shekel, but let's say the father said, only give my son a shekel and no more, then what's the halacha? Ein nostin lahem ela shekel. So we go ahead and we only give them a shekel. We only give them a shekel. So in other words, we'll say, so in this case over here, the father was much more explicit than his lashon. Atitnu lahen ela shekel. Only give my son a shekel and no more. In that case, we only give the kid a shekel and nothing else. Okay. If you look at the Rashbam says, Atitnu hainu kpeda enos shekel. So again, because we'll say, if you see again, that lashon is kpeda. The father is makbid. Do not, so we'll say, here the distinction. In case number 1, the father says, Tenu shekel ibni l'Shabbos, give my kid a shekel per Shabbos. So we take that to mean support my kid. So the kid needs a sela. All right, give him a sela. But the father means no excess. Case number 2. Al titnu lahem ela shekel. Only give my kid a shekel. That means that's hakpada. Give him a shekel and no more. V'mamar, listen to this. Now, what if the father said in addition to that, Imesu amid beis, Imesu yirshu achirim tachtehem. Ooh, listen to this. So now let's say the father's going overseas, and what does he say? He says, give my kid a shekel. Give my kid a shekel. And by the way, Imesu, if my son, right? Father says, if the son dies, yirshu achirim tachtehem. So what's happening over here is the father is allocating the Yerusha to someone else. So give the seller. In other words, I'm locking in support. Let's go like this. Yaakov is going overseas. So Yaakov says, give a shekel to my son Ruvain per week. Okay, so now case number 1 is he said a shekel. So the halacha number 1 is we assume shekel just means support. So even if Ruvain needs a seller, we give Ruvain a seller, but it just means support and no excess. Case number 2, Yaakov is going overseas. He says, only give Ruvain a shekel. So then we interpret that to mean what? Only a shekel and no more. Now, case number 3 is if Ruvain says that if halacha l'maisa, Ruvain dies. Say Ruvain dies. Now, in general, if Ruvain were to die, what would happen? Ruvain's kids would inherit that right of support. Now, but in this case, what Yaakov says is, and if Ruvain dies, I want to assign this support to Levi. So Ruvi's essentially what Yaakov says is, I don't want this right to be inherited by Ruvain's kids. Instead, I'm going ahead and giving it to someone else. So if he says Yirshu Achirim Tachtei, I'm looking at the Rashbam for just a moment. Top Rashbam 129b. Yirshu Achirim Ploni Uploni Velo Bnei Banai. So again, what Yaakov is saying is, I'm assigning this inheritance to someone else and not to my grandsons. Wow. So we'll say, now watch this. So now what we're saying is like this. Let's say we have a hybrid case now. We take the part on number 1. Ruvain says, sorry, keep your looks at the names. Yaakov says, okay, I'm just going to switch. Avraham. Avraham is always that good patriarchal name, right? So Avraham, so is Yaakov, of course, and I'm not choosing any sides of it, right? But again, right? Avraham is going overseas, right? So Avraham says, Avraham wants to leave support for his son Yitzchak. So if Avraham goes ahead and says, right, leave a shekel, right, give a shekel to my kid, we look at that shekel as not an exact amount. Rather, how do we look at shekel? How do we look at shekel? Support. So therefore, if Yitzchak needs a selah, we're going to give Yitzchak a selah. That's case one. Case two, Avraham says, only give a shekel to Yitzchak. Then we look at that statement as exact, only give. Case three is an interesting hybrid case. Let's say Avraham says, give a shekel to Yitzchak. But if Yitzchak dies, I don't want Yitzchak's kids to inherit the right of support, so instead, allocate the support to Yishmael. Allocate support to Yishmael. So we'll say, in this case, something very interesting happening. So what does that show? The Gemara says, what does that show? That shows that Avraham is interested in preserving his property, which then allows us to understand that in that case, when Avraham now is assigning Yerusha to someone other than Yitzchak's offspring, right? Because in normal circumstances, if Yitzchak were to die, then Yitzchak's kids would inherit that right of support, that shekel per week. Bless you. The fact that Avraham is assigning that support to someone else indicates that Avraham is very interested in the preservation of his assets. And because of that, we interpret his statement about the shekel to be exactly a shekel and no more. Right? So the allocation of the estate to someone other than the heir of Yitzchak allows us to understand a window into Avraham. He's very focused on the preservation of his assets. So even though he said, give a shekel to my son Yitzchak, and even though we said normally shekel just means support, in this case, because he's clearly interested in the preservation of the estate, we interpret shekel to mean only shekel and no more. Incredible. So therefore, in that case, bring back to the Gemara, Bein sha'amar tnu, bein sha'amar al titnu. So whether Avraham said give a shekel or only give a shekel, ein nosnin lahan el shekel. We only go ahead and allocate a shekel to Yitzchak's support and no more. That was a fascinating case. What does that have to do with us? Listen to this. V'ha tekishtei sados u'kishnei b'nei adam dami v'katani dekani. Now, both say, if you think about this, this is similar to a case of 2 fields to 2 people, right? Because remember again, on one hand, Avraham is allocating something to Yitzchak. He's also allocating something to Yishmael, right? Now, obviously, the gift to Yishmael is only if Yitzchak passes away, but it's 2 fields to 2 people. And yet, Rabbi say, what do you see over here? Yet to one, it is a lashon of matana. To the other, it is a lashon of Yerusha. And yet both work. What do you see from here? That even 2 people, 2 fields, and one expression of matana, one expression of Yerusha, both are treated as matana. Wow. So both say, so now the problem, of course, is this contradicts what we said before. Now, I'm sorry, not contradicts. This is Rav Sheshes, right? Remember again, Rav Sheshes was the one who said that not only do we say when there is transactional singularity, that as long as one of the transactions have matana, both are considered matanas. But Rav Sheshes went so far to say that even in the case of 2 people, 2 fields, as long as in one of the transactions you use lashon of matana, both are deemed a matana. Rav Sheshes says, where do I get it from? Here it is. From this case, Rav Sheshes says, this case, the shekel case, is the source of my position. Incredible. The Gemara says, who mosiv la v'hu mefarik la. This is a different case. He raised the kasha and he asked and he answered it. Bara'i liyarsho, Rabbi Yochanan ben Barokahi. So Rabbi say this is a different kind of case. In this case, it must be that Yishmael is in line for succession, right? Yishmael is in the inheritance queue, right? Yishmael is not just stam a guy, right? But Yishmael is part of the inheritance chain of Avraham, and this reflects the view of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. Now, truth is, we'll see Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka in tomorrow's Gemara, actually in the Mishnah in tomorrow, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says that you could assign inheritance to someone as long as they are in your inheritance chain. So therefore, again, perhaps this case is not really such a chiddush, but the reason why Avraham is using the lashon of Yerusha by Yishmael is because Yishmael is in Avraham's Yerusha chain, and therefore, again, this Gemara reflects the view of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka that you could assign inheritance property to someone in your inheritance chain, and it works. Amar Rashi says, Tashma. Let's analyze it a bit more. Tashma. Okay. Very interesting case, really quickly. Rashi says like this. I say the following. Ruvain, right? Or I should say, my property will go to you, and after you it goes to Shimon, and after you it goes to Levi. So what's the halacha? Meis Rishon Kana Sheni. So obviously when Reuven dies, so again I'm just creating a succession, an inheritance succession. So if Reuven dies, ultimately again Shimon acquires it. Meis Sheni, Shimon dies. Kana Shlishi, Levi acquires it. Meis Sheni Bechaye Rishon. But I will say, here's what's interesting. What happens if Shimon dies during Reuven's lifetime? So now again, I assign the property to Reuven. Right? And now what happened? And after Reuven dies, it goes to Shimon. After Shimon, Levi. Shimon predeceases Reuven. What happens to the property? So the Gemara says, Meis Sheni Bechaye Rishon, Yachzru Nechasim Liyarshe Rishon. Ultimately, again, the property goes to the inheritors of Reuven. So interestingly enough, the death of Shimon disrupts the flow, right? The flow of the bequest. And therefore, again, if Shimon predeceases Reuven, the property will go to Reuven's heirs. The Gemara says, so I'll say, is this not like a case of 2 fields and 2 people? And yet, and yet it works. So the Gemara says, so I'll say, this seems to be a support of Rav Sheshes, but as a contradiction to all the aforementioned opinions. So the Gemara said, so maybe we'll say same case. Maybe I will say in this case, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are all in my inheritance queue, and this is the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, who holds that halacha l'maisa, you could assign property to people as long as they are in your inheritance queue. Again, tomorrow's Mishnah. If that's the case, Meis Sheni Kana Shlishi. If that's the case, then halacha l'maisa, if Shimon dies, right? What do you mean if Shimon dies and then Levi acquires it? Hashalach Rav Acha Bereid Rav Avia L'divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, Nechase L'chav Acharecha L'ploni. Right? If ultimately again a person goes ahead and says, I'm bequeathing my property to you, right? And afterwards it should go to Ploni. So then what's that halacha? Rishon Roi Liyarsho. And number 1, right? Person number 1 is in my inheritance queue. Ein l'shini b'makom rishon klum. Then halacha l'maisa again, guy number 2 gets nothing. Why? Because guy number 1 inherits it all because he's in the inheritance queue. She'ein zeh lashon matana ela lashon Yerusha. Because this is not a lashon of a gift, rather it's a lashon of Yerusha. Watch this. Yerusha ein la hefsek. And Yerusha has no interruption. In other words, once you start the Yerusha chain, you can't interrupt that. To which the Gemara says, you're right, to yufta, the kulu to yufta. This effectively refutes all of the other previous held opinions. So I'll say, so we'll have to stop over here for today. I know we're stopping a little bit kind of in the middle of the sugya, but I don't want to rush the conclusion. So I'll say, so just understand what we're leaving off with over here. What we're leaving off with over here in the middle of Abosai is this. Here's what we know from the Mishnah. Right? So Abosai, remember, where did this all start? This all started from the idea that if you're gifting property to someone, you use the lashon of matana and Yerusha, we seize the lashon of matana and pretty much ignore the lashon of Yerusha. This conversation now exploded to go into cases where there are multiple transactions happening over here. Either, again, 2 fields to 1 person, 1 field to 2 people, 2 fields to 2 people, and then creates this whole challenge of a situation where in these transactions, for some of these transactions I'm using the lashon of matana, for some I'm using the lashon of Yerusha, so what do I do? Do I need transactional singularity or not? 4-way machlokes now you've established. Halacha l'maisa in Eretz Yisrael resolution tomorrow. Bosai shkoyach. So if anyone could help to make the Shiva Minyan at the Shiva Home for Selma Wolf, 2018 Burdock Road. Again, we're going to start davening here. Will start now, but Amir Hashem davening at the Shiva Home at 6:45. Thank you in advance.